Welcome to Breaking Down Bergman. I'm David Friend.
And I'm Sonia Strimban.
We're looking at Shame.
Du kan du tänka dig, jag hade en sån egendomlig dröm. Vet du vad jag drömde? Jag drömde att vi var tillbaka i orkestern. Vi satt där bredvid varandra och repeterade fjärde Brandenburg-konserten. Långsamma satsen. Och allt det här som är nu, det hade vi bakom oss. Vi bara minns det som en mardröm. Vaknade om att jag grät. Jag började gråta redan medan vi spelade. Det var långsamma satsen. Du vet den där... Tai, 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 ti, tai, ti, tai, ti, tai, ta.
Tänker du inte raka dig idag heller?
Ja, om du nödvändigt vill det så.
I think it's important for us to frame this movie before we get started. There was a lot of Swedish guilt surrounding World War II because the country supplied iron to the Germans, and they also didn't really take a position on either side of the war. And I think you need to add that in consideration to the fact that Shame came out during the Vietnam War. But what's interesting is that this is a movie about all wars and no wars in some ways.
Bergman leaves it very unclear as to what conflict, if any conflict, he's referring to in particular. So, for example, he gives us one nation within fighting, so it's a civil war. But he doesn't, put a stake in the ground in terms of whether they're fighting over land, or whether they're fighting over a throne, or whether they're fighting over a political ideology. It's really ambiguous as to who's on what side and who's justified in their attacks.
What I think is interesting, though, is that by avoiding any specific wars, Bergman sort of opens this film up to interpretation. And I think you saw that when Shame hit theaters, because people had seen Persona and the person who set themselves on fire during the Vietnam War, and they were sort of considering that when they were looking at Shame and seeing what does Bergman have to say about the Vietnam War here. But, stepping back today, we could, put this against the Gulf War, we could put this against any war.
I think really it's a film about conflict. And to be honest with you, I feel like the war scenes with the explosions and the gunfire and the death and the interrogations and all of that, which was pretty much the first half of the movie, is too protracted. I don't think it needed to be that long. And it's very atypical to Bergman. Like, we haven't seen him being this kind of director using all these pyrotechnics. Yes. It's not native to him. And for me, the real interesting and more intricate part of the movie started halfway through after the war had ended and they were in the ceasefire. And then the film refocused on the actual relationship by the two main characters who were affected by the war, Jan and Eva.
And that's where we sort of get the familiar Bergman. They're on an island, isolated from everyone, physically and perhaps mentally. And it's when the war stops that this internal turmoil really begins.
I think there's levels of turmoil as well. I mean, there's the conflict in their relationship, and then there's also their own personal internal struggles that they're trying to work out throughout the film. It's interesting because for me, it kind of goes back to a very early theme that Bergman toyed with in the first decade of his films, where he was looking at kind of the conflicts of masculinity and when masculinity becomes subverted because of external influences that are in society, for example. So social systems, patriarchy, whatever the case, that really emasculates the male character.
This is really early Bergman, like a ship to India, I'm thinking.
But here we're seeing that again, where we have this, we have the war, it's an external conflict, society is unraveling, and in that kind of film, you would typically see the hero being a soldier, fighting, saving, rescuing.
We get a broken man.
He's not eligible for the army. He lost his job. He's a musician in an orchestra. And even within the situation that he's in, within the couple with his wife, he's the submissive one. He's the one that is rattled by the noise of the war. He's the one that sits in the stairwell and cries and rocks in the fetal position. She's really the strong one trying to get them through it, and she gets exasperated with him almost like with a child.
It's his emasculation that I think really forms the title that is Shame and the theme of this film. And it has to do with Eva as much as it has to do with him. She has an affair, and it marks a real turning point as he discovers this infidelity, this betrayal. You know, it wasn't the war, it wasn't the fact that he had been taken prisoner and was unable to fend for himself. It wasn't losing his job. I mean, the list adds up on the ways that he could have been pushed to the brink of becoming that, archetypal male character. And it's interesting that that is what Bergman uses as the trigger for this rolling effect. And it starts with his own lies, and he lies about the money that creates the climax of the film. And that builds to the point that he kills the man who Eva had, committed the infidelity with. And this rampage eventually takes Eva, who had been what we would have considered the masculine character, and tears her down to being a vulnerable, weak woman who is, crying like he was in the stairwell at the beginning of the film.
There is a real reversal between the two characters, and there's a noticeable shift and turning point in the movie, as you say. It also corresponds with kind of the ceasefire and the war saga ending and then going into this interiority of the relationship. What's interesting is that everything from the couple is really stripped and taken away. Their home is destroyed, their efforts to rebuild it are destroyed, their country is destroyed, any political, societal affiliations are also completely ruined. It's like a no man's land. And you would think that with that blank page, in a way, they're given the opportunity to rebuild, to reconstruct, to really make something of themselves as noble people. And what Bergman is actually showing us is the opposite. It's hard to understand why he would take them down this path instead of giving them some kind of noble essence to kind of redeem themselves, which is what we've seen in previous films from Bergman. There's always that kernel of human goodness. It's kind of absent here, and the film ends very morosely.
When Bergman tears down the society that exists around them to its most basic sense, that is when things really start to fall apart, which is interesting because Bergman has always been critical of society's structure and authority and all of the things that you think would make a society. But perhaps Bergman is suggesting that if society crumbles, the people fall as well.
For me, there's also this element of the Adam and Eve story, if you will. You have these two characters. Her name is Eva, in fact. And, after the war ends, they kind of have this idyllic situation, if you will. They're in the country, they have a greenhouse, their place has been reconstructed, it's nice, right? And like I said, they have this chance to rebuild things, to be in the garden, if you will. And then you have Jacobi, the man that Eva has an affair with, who's kind of like the serpent figure. And he tempts her and manipulates her by facilitating this nice home and giving her gifts and giving her money and attentions that we assume is not getting from her husband. And so then it all falls apart once that gets discovered. And they're in a way banished from the garden, except what they're banished to is not any kind of salvation, it's not any kind of redemption. It's a sea of death.
The scene on the boat at the finale of the film as they're trying to leave the island is particularly powerful as they struggle to get through the waters. The bodies of soldiers are just lining the area, and as they try and sort of push them out of the way and make their way through, it just seems futile. And it leaves you with a lot of questions. I guess one, is the couple's relationship going to survive? But on a more basic sense, is the couple going to survive? I mean, they're on the boat, they're with a bunch of other people, there's no food, the water is down to drips, and just everything seems so uncertain. But at the same time, on this boat, all of that conflict that existed before is gone. There's no rivalry. And as they struggle to get past these bodies, I think there's almost a bigger message in this imagery. The fact that, no matter how hard they struggle to get past the dead soldiers, they can't. It's a futile attempt. And that harkens back to us discussing the aspects of World War II and the fact that Sweden was never really able to get beyond this shadow that basically was haunting a nation.
I don't know if I would go as far as to say that the entire film is kind of pinned to Sweden's guilt post-World War II. Like, I don't think it's as easily summarized as that. But I think there is a larger message about conflict, both on a personal, individual level and the responsibility that you have to take for that, and also conflict on a larger societal scale. And the soldiers in the water, to me, represent kind of the residual entrapment that happens after you do something so harmful. Whether it's a scale thing, right? It's magnitude of scale, whether it's in your relationship and you directly hurt another person and they are stuck in that, or if it's a national conflict, as you're saying, where a nation is divided and ripped apart by the atrocities that they commit against each other, and then for generations forward, they're then entrapped by that. We see a real turning point in the film where all the war, stuff and explosions and atrocities and interrogations, it all ends, and there seems to be some kind of ceasefire period, and there's really a chance for Jan and Eva to rebuild. They've stayed on the island, but everything was taken away from them. The countryside is destroyed, their means of livelihood is destroyed, their home has been destroyed. It's really been like a purging. They've been through hell and back, and now they are left to rebuild their lives. And you would think that this would really be an opportunity for them to find themselves again, to make a relationship work from the trauma, to heal each other, love each other, and start anew. For me, the film really began in the center when he started looking at the relationship of Jan and Eva and looking at the interior conflict. Mm-hmm. The rest of the stuff, I don't want to call it window dressing, but that would be harsh. And that would be unfair because it was larger than that, but it was there to amplify their experience and kind of the human experience through a traumatic event, regardless of what the event is. And I think the reason that he ambiguously presented the war to us was, as we mentioned in the beginning, it was to represent all wars, any wars, no wars.
I just think in a film, everything is intentional, and especially in a Bergman film. So the war is here for a reason, and it's not just to establish the frame of that relationship. I think that would be a little bit misleading. This is a war movie in some ways, and that is something that I've kind of grappled with, because once you get into the body of shame as a story, it doesn't seem like it's a war movie. But what then to make of the bodies floating in the water at the end? I just felt like Bergman didn't want to make his entire movie about the war. But by ending the film the way he did, he has the Bergman film that a lot of audiences would expect, but then he has a war movie.
Honestly, I think if you substitute war for natural disaster, you could still have the same effect with basically the middle part of the couple being as is.
But what would
having a bunch of dead bodies that died from a flood or cholera or whatever you want. I think it would still be the same. I think what he's talking about is a purging and a destruction and a complete falling away of social structures because of some kind of climactic, disastrous event. In this case, it happens to be war. Honestly, I think he started playing with pyrotechnics and the whole thing just kind of got away from him. I don't think it was intended to be a war movie.
But do you feel that this is an essential Bergman movie?
I'm kind of conflicted about this one because I feel in a way he's doing something different, but at the same time, he's really reaching far back to themes that we haven't seen for, 20 years, which is interesting. And I really like the Liv Ullmann, Max von Sydow dynamic that seems to be evolving here. So I think it's worth watching. But again, essential is a strong word.
Yeah, the essential name has become a challenge for us because early on it made sense with the films in the 40s. They were really basic. And now it just seems to be causing a divide with a lot of people, including us a lot of times. But, we do have to strip it down to some sort of basic form, I think. For this one, I'm going to say, yes, it is essential. There are some really fresh elements in this movie that don't feel like Bergman. And there is plenty of social commentary that we could perceive in it. And then such a meaty relationship between this man and this woman. And I just think that the combination is fascinating. And Shame, I thought, was a really fantastic Bergman movie.
I think I'm on the fence enough that I'll defer to you and go with essential.
Okay. But let us know what you think of Shame. I know this film is a favorite of many, and I would be curious to know how you would position it in the Bergman canon.
We'd love to hear your feedback. You can comment on our YouTube page or visit us on Facebook.
That brings us to the end of another episode of Breaking Down Bergman. Be sure to join us next time where we're looking at The Right. And we will see you then on Breaking Down Bergman.